The lake was quiet that morning, unnervingly so. A thin veil of mist clung to the water, rippling as though whispering secrets only the brave dared to hear. From the wide glass windows of my lakefront mansion, I stood with a mug of coffee in hand, staring at the stillness. This house had been my sanctuary, cedar beams polished to a deep sheen, the smell of pine and lake water woven into its very walls. I had built it not just with money, but with years of work, sacrifice, and the promise to myself that one day I'd have peace. Peace, that was the one thing the Homeowners Association seemed determined to strip away from me. At the center of it all was Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood HOA. She wore power like a cheap perfume, overbearing, suffocating, impossible to ignore. For years, she had meddled in my affairs, criticizing the length of my grass, the color of my mailbox, even sending violation notices when my guests parked their cars a few inches over the curb line. I had brushed her off, choosing serenity over war, but deep down, I knew Karen thrived on control. That morning, though, I felt something was off. A call had come in from a local catering company, their cheery receptionist asking where they should unload the food trucks. Food trucks? I had repeated, confusion dripping into my voice. The woman laughed like I was playing dumb. Yes, sir. For the event. The one scheduled at your property this afternoon. We've got 200 pounds of brisket and about 100 guests confirmed. My heart had stopped cold. I remember setting my coffee down, my reflection warping in the black liquid as my pulse hammered. I hadn't planned any event. I hadn't invited a single person. Yet, within the hour, my driveway was clogged with delivery vans, florists, and decorators hauling string lights and tables across my lawn. And taped to the oak door, bold, smug, and infuriating, was a note in Karen's handwriting. HOA has reserved the lake house for a community gala. Attendance, 100 confirmed. Your cooperation is appreciated. That was the moment my sanctuary became a battlefield. The note fluttered in the wind, pinned to my oak door with a strip of cheap tape, as if this were some college dorm bulletin board and not my $1 million property on Lake Greenwood. My fist tightened around the paper until it crumpled, the ink smearing against my palm. HOA has reserved the lake house, 100 guests, cooperation appreciated. I could almost hear her voice, Karen Whitfield, with that nasal tone and smug tilt of her chin, the voice of a woman who never asked, only commanded. I stepped back onto the porch, watching as a team of decorators strung white lights across the trees lining my driveway. Their ladders leaned against my birches, their hammering echoing through the air. A catering truck hissed as it parked, its exhaust cloud choking the flower beds I had planted with my own hands. Across the lawn, strangers unfolded rental tables and rolled linen cloths like they owned the place. "Hey, who gave you permission to be here?" I shouted. One of the men, a lanky kid barely out of college, turned with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Whitfield said this was all approved," he said, scratching his head. "Whitfield?" I spat the name. "You mean Mrs. Whitfield?" "Yeah, the HOA president. She signed off on everything. Said the owner was a family friend and totally fine with it." My stomach lurched. Not only had Karen orchestrated this invasion, she had told these people I approved. I stormed back inside, my shoes pounding against polished hardwood floors. My phone buzzed with text notifications. A group thread, neighbors chattering about how excited they were for the community gala at my mansion. They were thanking Karen for securing the most beautiful venue in the neighborhood. Each new ping felt like a nail hammered deeper into my skull. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Finally, on the third try, she answered with that voice dipped in fake sweetness. "Oh, hello, Daniel," she said, dragging out my name like honey. "I assume you've seen the preparations. Isn't it wonderful? The whole neighborhood will get to enjoy your lovely property. Karen, what the hell do you think you're doing?" My voice shook with fury. "This is my home. My land. You don't get to throw a party here." "Relax," she crooned. "It's only one evening. You should be honored. 100 people celebrating at your mansion, it raises property values for everyone. It's for the community. I nearly dropped the phone. Honored? You're trespassing. This is theft. Oh, don't be dramatic, Daniel, she replied, her tone sharpening. It's already paid for. The caterers, the entertainment, everything. If you make a scene, you'll only embarrass yourself. The line clicked dead before I could answer. By noon, the first cars began arriving. Shiny SUVs lined the gravel drive, their tires chewing up the edges of my lawn. Men in blazers and women in glittering dresses strolled across my grass as if it were a public park. Laughter bubbled in the air, wine bottles uncorked, the scent of brisket and roasted chicken drifting from the buffet tables that had sprouted across my backyard. Inside, I paced like a caged animal. Every window framed a scene more surreal than the last, strangers posing for selfies on my dock, children running barefoot across my polished deck, and a live band unloading amps at the boathouse. It was invasion. Absolute invasion. Yet no one saw it that way. They clinked glasses, smiled at Karen, and congratulated her on such a brilliant idea. She stood in the center of it all, draped in a sparkling blue dress, her hair sprayed into an iron helmet. When her eyes met mine through the window, she smiled a slow, deliberate smirk that said, "What are you going to do about it?" I'll admit, for a moment, I almost lost my nerve. 100 guests. The entire neighborhood. If I called the police, what would they say? Disorderly conduct? Noise complaint? Karen had spun this so tightly that I looked like the lone madman in the middle of a grand celebration. But then something clicked. As I stood there, watching Karen raise her wineglass to a cheer of 50 voices, I felt the rage in my chest transform. It sharpened into something colder. Something stronger. They thought they could trespass, humiliate me, use my home as a stage. But what they hadn't counted on was my patience and my memory. Every single person at that gala was about to owe me. By midnight, the party ended in a blaze of fireworks over the lake. The last of the cars pulled away, leaving behind trampled grass, spilled drinks, and shattered glass glinting under the moonlight. My mansion reeked of barbecue smoke and perfume, the floors scuffed with muddy footprints. I walked through the wreckage, room by room, my fists clenched at my sides. But instead of despair, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Karen had won the night, yes. She had stolen my peace, my sanctuary. But tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. The morning after the so-called community gala, the lake was no longer quiet. It was bruised. Beer bottles floated lazily against the dock. Confetti clung to the water like oil slicks, bright against the gray reflection of the sky. My lawn looked like a battlefield, its once perfect ridges carved by tire tracks and the weight of rental trucks. I walked barefoot across the deck, surveying the damage. The smell hit first smoke, stale wine, and the sour tang of vomit near the garden beds. My hand brushed the cedar railing, sticky with spilled liquor. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. I called the police. 2 officers arrived by mid-morning, their cruiser rolling to a stop in my driveway. Officer Reynolds, tall with a mustache that looked older than the badge on his chest, squinted at the wreckage. His partner, a younger officer named Morales, scribbled notes on a pad. "So you're telling me," Reynolds said slowly, "the HOA president authorized a party here? Without your consent?" I nodded. She forged my approval. She told the caterers and vendors I was fine with it. She trespassed. She invited 100 people onto my private property. Reynolds tilted his head toward Morales, who gave a low whistle. "That's a mess." "Then arrest her," I demanded. "This is breaking and entering. Fraud. Something." But Reynolds just sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Hayes, it's not that simple. She didn't technically break in, the doors weren't forced, and it seems everyone believes she had permission. You could file a civil suit, sure, but criminal charges. I don't see that sticking." His words were gasoline to my rage. Civil suit. The phrase echoed in my head long after they left. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything: photographs of broken chairs, receipts left behind by caterers, even lipstick stains on my bathroom mirror. By the time I finished, I had assembled a file thick enough to choke a shredder. That evening, I sat at my mahogany desk, the smell of lemon oil from the polished wood mixing with the bitter sting of coffee. I opened my laptop and began to dig. And what I found turned my fury into firepower. Each guest who attended had signed something: RSVP forms, catering headcounts, even HOA confirmations listing their names and expected presence. Paper trails. Digital records. Proof that they weren't just innocent bystanders, they had knowingly participated in an event held on property that wasn't theirs. That was when the idea struck me, sharp as a lightning bolt. Why sue only Karen, when I could sue every single one of them? Trespass, damages, emotional distress, each claim carried weight. And in my state, the civil courts allowed up to $100,000 per violation. With 100 guests, that was a potential claim of $10 million. The thought made me laugh for the first time in days. Not a soft chuckle, an unhinged, cathartic laugh that echoed through the empty halls of my mansion. By Monday, my attorney, Lisa Carmichael, was sitting across from me in the study. Sharp-eyed, with auburn hair tied back into a severe bun, she flipped through the folder of evidence I had prepared. "This is," she began, scanning the pages, bold. "It's airtight," I insisted. "They entered without consent. They damaged property. They interfered with my right to enjoy my own home. Each of them signed their names. That's 100 separate lawsuits. 100 times 100,000. Lisa leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Daniel, the court will see this as excessive. Judges don't like it when people swing for the fences." "Then I'll swing anyway," I said. "I want them to know what it feels like to have everything ripped out from under you." Karen humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood. They all played along. They toasted on my dock. They laughed while my home was turned into a carnival. Not one of them stopped to ask if I agreed. Lisa studied me for a long moment, then closed the folder. "All right. We'll start drafting the complaints. But be prepared, they're going to fight back. Hard." The first wave hit 2 weeks later. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee and paper dust as I filed the stack of lawsuits, the clerk raising her eyebrows at the sheer volume. News spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street when they saw me. My mailbox overflowed with hate mail, each letter more venomous than the last. At the next HOA meeting, Karen stood in the center like a general rallying her troops. Her voice carried across the room as she denounced me as vindictive, unstable, and a danger to community spirit. Applause thundered from the crowd of homeowners, each of whom had received their own court summons. I walked in late, the doors slamming behind me, and silence fell like a curtain. "You enjoyed my house," I said, my voice cold. "You drank my wine, trampled my lawn, danced on my dock. And now you'll pay for it. Every single one of you." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face twisted into that familiar smirk, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes now: fear. Because she knew I wasn't bluffing. The weeks that followed were a storm. Depositions, motions, countersuits, it felt like the entire legal system had shifted its gaze onto my life. Neighbors whispered about me in grocery store aisles. Strangers online debated whether I was a hero defending his rights or a madman weaponizing the courts. But through it all, I never wavered. Every time I thought of backing down, I remembered the sound of laughter echoing through my walls, Karen's smug grin, the chaos left in the wake of that night. And each memory sharpened my resolve like a blade. By the time the first court date approached, I was no longer the quiet man who once stood on his deck, coffee in hand, dreaming of peace. I was something else now. And Karen Whitfield was about to learn just how far I was willing to go. Courtroom lights are colder than any noon sun. They bleach faces flat, turn warm skin into marble, and make small betrayals look enormous. When I stepped into the municipal courtroom that Thursday, the hush pressed against me like humidity. The gallery was full. Neighbors who had once waved from their porches now stared through glass eyes, a scattering of reporters sat with their phones ready, even Officer Reynolds took a seat in the back, as if curiosity had pulled him from routine to spectacle. Across from me, Karen Whitfield sat prim and taut in a navy suit, her chin lifted like a challenge. The HOA banner someone had struck through, fallen onto a folding chair, hung limp behind her counsel, Mark Benton, a man who smiled at everything like it was a joke at someone else's expense. Lisa Carmichael stood at my side, her jaw fixed, her notes a compact arsenal. We had practiced enough that neither of us needed to speak. We understood the choreography: calm, clarity, the unblinking stare of someone who knows the truth. Judge Marshall called the court to order with a voice that sounded like a gavel before the gavel. The trial had been 2 weeks of tight, ugly exposure, depositions replayed in unvarnished clips, Lisa's meticulous presentation of receipts and bridesmaid texts, the caterer's testimony about who'd signed contracts, social media posts pinned like butterflies under glass. We had built a case that wasn't just about trampled sod and wine stains. We had built a story of deliberate humiliation, of one woman using community trust as a cudgel and my home as a stage. The first witness Lisa called was Harold Bloom, a crater-eyed document examiner from the state lab. He walked slowly, as if the world were a gallery he couldn't trust, and took the oath with a soft "I do." "Mr. Bloom," Lisa began, "you examined the so-called owner authorization presented to the caterer and the HOA. What did you find?" He adjusted his glasses and lifted a packet of slides. "The signature attributed to Mr. Hayes on the venue authorization is not consistent with his known signatures. The pressure patterns differ. The slants, the stroke hesitations, the way certain letters form, these are signs of a traced or simulated signature." He tapped a magnified letter on the screen. "In my professional opinion, that signature was not made by Mr. Daniel Hayes." A tremor moved across the gallery. Karen's face was flat steel for a heartbeat, then a filter of color rushed up her neck. Mark Benton objected, but the ruling favored Lisa, and the evidence stayed. Next came the caterer, a bulky woman with a voice like gravel, who recalled the chain of phone calls that had sealed the event. The person booking said she was president of the HOA and had the owner's approval. We asked where the owner was. She said, and I quote, "Daniel is a family friend, don't worry about him." She left us a signed venue agreement that night. Her hands found the table rail. We took her at her word. Lisa's cross-examination was surgical. She laid out a timeline that wrapped around Karen, repeated HOA violations she'd engineered against me, the meeting minutes in which Karen argued for community unification events, a portfolio of emails where Karen negotiated pricing and vendors, and the crucial metadata and email chain showing the venue approval sent from an address that mimicked mine. The IP logs, pulled by a technician Lisa subpoenaed, traced the message not to my office or my home, but to an IP registered to Karen Whitfield. When the IT specialist testified, Karen's composure cracked like a cheap porcelain plate. She had insisted, for weeks, that she'd never falsified anything. Her voice had been trimmed of color and conviction, but here, under oath, and confronted with cold server logs, the story metastasized into admissions. Yes, she'd initiated the booking. Yes, she had told vendors the owner approved. Yes, she had created the email thread to make things easier. Her last attempt at defense, "I didn't think it would matter," sounded small and childlike. Then the room held its breath for the most human moment of the trial. Lisa called me to the stand. I had rehearsed it harder than any deposition or press statement. But rehearsals are cold practice, the real thing carries all the weights rehearsals leave off. When the oath was given, my voice felt a little foreign in my throat, like a borrowed violin's first note. "Why did you bring 100 separate lawsuits?" Mark Benton asked during his cross, his voice oily with attempt to magnify greed. "Because they came onto my property," I said. "They drank my wine. They danced where my children used to learn to swim. They laughed on my dock. Some of them helped themselves to my bar. It wasn't simply an accident, it was a concerted, celebratory invasion, and Karen coerced consent by lying about it. Each person had a choice to leave. They chose to stay. The words tasted of ash and resolve. I brought suits because trespass isn't a single event when 100 people accept a lie and act on it. Each handshake, each step across my floor, each wineglass raised, it's a discrete harm. There were moments when the courtroom felt like a movie and moments when time folded inward, the smallest sound magnified, a pen drop, a murmur, Karen's breath. One witness came forward whose testimony cut through the noise, Emily Carter, a 30-something neighbor who'd posted those smiling pictures of the gala on Instagram, the same photos that had tormented me for weeks. On the stand she looked younger up close and raw. "I'm embarrassed," she said. "I thought it was a community thing. I didn't think to ask. But after the party, when I saw how your home looked, I felt awful." Her eyes brimmed. "I stayed because I didn't want to make a scene. I stayed because everyone else was staying." That honesty landed like a soft brick. Mark Benton tried to spin it into cowardice, Lisa spun it into accountability. At closing, Lisa's voice held a slow heat. "This case is not about scores and vengeance," she told the jury. "It's about responsibility. It's about that moment when someone uses community trust to erase another's rights. The law's remedies exist not to bask in the suffering of others but to correct, to deter. Mr. Hayes seeks recompense for the damage, yes, but also a declaration that private property and dignity matter." Mark's closing painted me as a man who weaponized the court. "He wants $10 million, he said. He wants to punish a neighborhood for a single mistake." But his cadence had the tremor of someone who knew his client's story had holes. The jury retired. I walked the line of windows that looked out on Lake Greenwood, the water no longer bruised but shimmering, a slow wind ruffling its surface. It felt strange to stand and wait with so many lives balanced on a verdict slip. I thought of the quiet morning I'd first kept here, a coffee mug steaming, light sliding across cedar, and I felt the old ache of grief for what had been and what the fight had cost. When they filed back in, the foreperson's voice was small, human. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff on counts of trespass, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." A sound ripped out of Karen, something between a sob and a scream, and the courtroom swelled with 1,000 little reactions. The amount calculations took longer, but Lisa had positioned the damages argument tightly, and the judge, stern, eyes like flint, entered an award that would make the neighborhood's teeth ache: $100,000 for the trespass claim, $50,000 for property damage, and $50,000 in punitive damages directed at Karen for her deliberate misconduct. The award was structured so that Karen, as the principal actor, bore the brunt of personal liability. The individual guests were offered structured settlements to avoid bankrupting them, a compromise that balanced law with the human realities of neighbors and mortgages. I should have felt triumph like fire. Instead, I felt a long exhale, like stepping from a storm into a cold, clean valley. Victory landed like weight, real and consequential. People muttered about fairness and spite, about community spirit and social media. Some neighbors came forward, ashamed, wanting to help repair the property they'd marred. Others avoided my gaze altogether. Karen, stripped of the HOA presidency before the week ended, packed her things with a kind of mechanical grace. There were whispers of an indictment for forgery. Whether it would go forward I didn't know. She left with a stiff back and a smaller step, and the neighborhood's gossip was both a weight and its own exile. In the weeks after the verdict, I walked my lawn like a man walking a path he'd reclaimed. I replaced the scuffed boards on the deck, repaired the garden beds, and planted a row of white pines along the dock. Lisa negotiated settlements with many of the guests. Emily Carter came by one afternoon with a tray of lemon bars and a handwritten apology. We sat on the repaired cedar bench and talked like adults who'd been children learning consequences. Money, as it turns out, fixes many things and buys nothing of the quiet that once existed. I used a portion of the settlement to restore the mansion, new linens, a professional cleanup, a small endowment for real community events that would require proper permissions and transparency. I put another portion in escrow to rebuild a trust fund for my children, something practical for a future I hadn't wanted to gamble on. On a late autumn morning, sitting with a mug that had a chip where my ring once hid it in a fit of fury, I watched the lake and felt something that was not the old peace but a steadier thing: consequence. Justice isn't a bell that once rung returns the world to its earlier light. It's an action loud, messy, and imperfect that shifts lines and asks people, sometimes painfully, to account for themselves. Karen was gone from my life, but the echo of that night lingered like a scar. The neighborhood learned that community wasn't a cloak for coercion. I learned that a man's home could be a battlefield and a courtroom his last refuge. And in the wash of aftermath, I found a new edge of quiet, a house still, finally, mine, and a harder memory that would keep me vigilant. When the lake caught the sun that afternoon and broke it into glitter, I thought of the first morning I'd stood here. The coffee was still my anchor, but now it tasted differently, less like piece one, more like piece purchased, necessary and expensive, but mine to hold.